I don't know where I am, but it's not Earth.
If it finds us, that's the end of it.
It's not a god. It's a virus. It infects everything it can reach.
Nathan Cole awoke to the sound of his own ragged breathing, his lungs burning as if he'd been plunged into thin air. His body ached from the fall, though he couldn't recall falling. Around him, the world was cloaked in an eerie, oppressive twilight. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but his surroundings refused to resolve into anything familiar. The sky churned above him, a swirling mass of crimson clouds laced with jagged streaks of black lightning. The horizon was warped, as though the entire world was collapsing inward. The ground beneath him wasn't ground at all. It was soft and unsteady, like flesh stretched too tight over bone. When he pushed himself up, his hands came away slick with something warm and viscous. Blood? No, not blood. Something thicker, something alive. He stumbled backward, his boots sinking into the quivering surface, and felt the unsettling give of muscle-like tissue beneath his feet. His mind reeled. This wasn't the lab, this wasn't Earth. He tried to recall the experiment, the quantum phase shift, the reactor's sudden surge, but the memories were fragmented, as if someone had smashed them with a hammer and left him to piece them together. The last thing he remembered was the brilliant flash of light. Then nothing. Now he was here, wherever here was. Nathan's breathing quickened as he scanned the landscape. Towers rose in the distance, but they weren't buildings. They twisted upward like organic spires, their surfaces pulsating with veins that glowed faintly in the dim light. Tendrils extended from their bases, anchoring themselves into the fleshy ground like the roots of a malignant plant. They pulsed rhythmically, as though drawing sustenance from the world itself. "Where the hell am I?" he whispered, though his voice felt tiny against the immense wrongness of the place. A distant sound broke through his thoughts, a low, guttural hum that resonated through the ground. Nathan turned toward it, his heart pounding. He saw movement along the horizon, dark shapes shifting and undulating as they slithered closer. He didn't wait to find out what they were. Instinct kicked in, and he ran, his boots slipping on the treacherous surface. The terrain grew more treacherous the farther he fled. Great fissures split open beneath him, exposing what looked like writhing organs buried just beneath the surface. The air itself seemed hostile, thick with a metallic tang that burned his throat with every breath. He stumbled and fell hard, scraping his palms against the ground. That's when he saw them. Humanoid figures, hunched and shambling, emerged from the shadows. But they weren't human, not anymore. Their skin was stretched and torn, revealing grotesque fusions of flesh and alien tissue. Bone jutted out at unnatural angles, and their eyes glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. They moved with a jerking, insect-like rhythm, their heads tilting unnaturally as they spotted him. Nathan froze, his mind racing. He wanted to believe they were survivors, victims of some unspeakable tragedy, but the way they moved, the way they clicked, told him otherwise. He backed away slowly, his every instinct screaming at him to run, but his body refused to obey. One of the creatures raised a long, segmented limb that had once been an arm, A sharp, wet sound filled the air as its flesh split apart, revealing a grotesque maw lined with jagged teeth. Nathan's paralysis broke. He turned and bolted, his pulse thundering in his ears. He didn't know how long he ran, only that his legs burned and his lungs begged for air. The shambling figures pursued him, their screeches echoing through the unnatural landscape. Just as he thought his body would give out, he spotted an opening in the ground ahead. An entrance to what looked like a tunnel carved into the flesh-like terrain. Without thinking, he dove inside, tumbling down a slick, sloping passage that deposited him into darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Nathan lay on the ground, gasping for breath, the echo of his pursuers' shrieks growing distant. He tried to sit up, but his head spun, and he collapsed back onto the floor. A faint light glimmered ahead. Gathering what strength he had left, Nathan crawled toward it, his hands scraping against the uneven surface. The light grew brighter, revealing a cavernous space filled with makeshift shelters made from scavenged metal and organic debris. Figures moved in the shadows, human figures. "Stop right there," a voice barked, sharp and commanding. Nathan froze, raising his hands weakly as a group of people emerged from the gloom. They were armed with crude weapons, metal pipes, blades fashioned from shards of alien bone, but their faces were unmistakably human. "Who are you?" the leader demanded, a woman with a scar running down the side of her face. Her dark eyes burned with suspicion, but there was something else there too. Desperation. "My name is Nathan," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how I got here. Please, I just want to understand where I am." The woman exchanged glances with her companions. After a tense moment, she lowered her weapon, though her grip remained tight. "You're in hell," she said flatly. "Welcome to the last place in the multiverse where humans still fight back." Nathan stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. Hell? No, this wasn't hell. Hell was a myth, a story told to frighten children. But as he looked into her haunted eyes, as he felt the alien flesh quiver beneath him, he realized she wasn't speaking metaphorically. This place was hell, and he had just arrived. The underground sanctuary was damp and cold, carved into the rotting underbelly of Terra Umbra's alien terrain. Faint, bioluminescent light emanated from the walls, casting a sickly green glow over the rebels' makeshift camp. Nathan sat on the edge of a battered crate, his thoughts swirling as he tried to ignore the rhythmic thrum of the hive above. The sound was everywhere, a pulse that seemed to come from the very core of the planet. He couldn't tell if it was the heartbeat of the alien overlord or the planet itself slowly dying. "Karathis controls everything," Mara explained, her voice sharp and focused. She stood across from Nathan, gesturing to a crude map etched into a sheet of salvaged metal. The map was detailed, showing the layout of the hive and the surrounding ruins. Her scar caught the dim light, a stark reminder of the cost of resistance. The hive isn't just its home, it's part of it. Every wall, every tendril, every harvester is connected to the central brain. Nathan frowned, leaning forward to examine the map. If it's all one organism, then it must have vulnerabilities, neural pathways, synaptic junctions. If we can find the right frequency, we might be able to disrupt its control, sever the brain from the body. Mara crossed her arms, her dark eyes studying him. "And you think you can do that? Just like that?" Nathan hesitated. He wasn't sure. The science behind his theory was sound, at least in his universe, but this place was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Still, he couldn't afford doubt. Not now. "I'll need equipment. Something to generate a resonance wave strong enough to overload its neural network." "We don't exactly have state-of-the-art tech lying around," a voice interjected. It was Derek, a wiry man with a jagged scar across his lip and a permanent sneer on his face. He leaned against the wall, sharpening a blade made from what looked like alien bone. "We barely have enough supplies to keep ourselves alive, and you want to build some kind of sound machine?" Nathan met Derek's gaze, his tone calm but firm. "If you've got a better idea, I'm all ears." Derek said nothing, but the tension in the room was palpable. Mara stepped between them, raising a hand to silence the brewing argument. "Enough. If Nathan has a plan, we'll do what we can to make it work. We've been fighting Karathis for years with nothing but scraps and desperation. Maybe it's time we tried something different." The group dispersed, each member returning to their tasks. Nathan stayed behind, studying the map and making notes on a scrap of paper. Mara lingered, watching him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Why did you come here?" she asked quietly. Nathan didn't look up. "I didn't. I was pulled here. An accident. And now you're stuck with us." "Looks that way." Mara leaned against the wall, her expression softening slightly. "If you can really pull this off, if we can destroy the Hive, maybe we'll finally have a chance to take our planet back." Nathan nodded, though he didn't share her optimism. He had seen enough to know that victory wouldn't come without a cost. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Nathan worked tirelessly, scavenging parts from the rebels' limited supplies to construct a makeshift resonance device. The rebels helped where they could, though Derek's skepticism never wavered. The device began to take shape, a crude array of salvaged metal, wires, and alien biotissue that hummed faintly with an unnatural energy. But their progress wasn't without setbacks. On the third night, the Hive's patrols grew more aggressive. The harvesters were closing in, their grotesque forms skittering through the ruins like predators on the hunt. One of the rebels, a young woman named Ilara, didn't return from her scouting mission. Her absence hung over the camp like a shadow, a grim reminder of the stakes they faced. It was during this tense time that Nathan discovered the true horror of Karathis biology. While scavenging near the Hive's outskirts, he stumbled upon a grotesque scene. A cluster of human bodies fused together into a single writhing mass. Their faces were frozen in expressions of agony, their limbs twisted into unnatural shapes. The mass pulsated rhythmically, its flesh shimmering with a faint, sickly light. Nathan realized it was some kind of relay, a biological conduit that extended Karathis' control across the planet. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. The horror of it was almost too much to bear. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something else. One of the faces in the mass, a young boy's, twitched. The eyes rolled toward him, and the mouth moved, forming a single agonized word: help. Nathan fled, his mind reeling. He didn't tell the others what he had seen, not yet. He didn't know how to explain it, and he wasn't sure they needed another reason to hate Carathis. But the image stayed with him, a haunting reminder of what they were up against. By the time the device was ready, the rebels were on edge. Supplies were dwindling, and the Hive's patrols were getting closer. Nathan gathered the group in the main chamber, his voice steady despite the weight of their situation. "We have one shot at this," he said. "Once we activate the device, Carathis will know. We'll have to fight our way to the core and plant it directly in the Hive's brain. If it works, it'll sever its control and shut down the harvesters. If it doesn't..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Mara stepped forward, her gaze fierce. "Then we make sure it dies with us." The rebels nodded, their faces grim but resolute. Darek muttered something under his breath but didn't argue. Nathan felt a flicker of hope, tempered by the knowledge of what lay ahead. As they prepared to leave, Nathan caught Mara's eye. "You said you've been fighting this thing for years. Why haven't you given up?" Mara's expression hardened. "Because giving up means letting it win, and I won't let it take anything else from me." Nathan didn't press her further. He understood. They all had their reasons for fighting, their scars that drove them forward. For the first time since arriving in this nightmare, he felt like he had a purpose. And for the first time, he felt afraid of what that purpose might cost him. The entrance to the Hive loomed before them, an obscene organic gateway that pulsed and writhed as though it were alive. It exhaled a fetid breath that carried the stench of decay and blood, a stench that clung to Nathan's throat and made his stomach churn. The walls of the opening shimmered with a wet, mucus-like substance that reflected the dim light of the rebels' torches. Nathan hesitated at the threshold, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but Mara's steady gaze kept him grounded. She nodded once, and he followed her into the abyss. Inside the Hive was an abomination of flesh and sinew. The walls were lined with undulating veins that pulsed in rhythm with the omnipresent thrum Nathan had heard since his arrival. Every step felt wrong, the ground squelching beneath their boots, as if they were walking on the entrails of some gargantuan beast. The air was humid and thick, filled with an acrid metallic tang that made it difficult to breathe. Darek led the way, his blade drawn and his eyes scanning for movement. Nathan clutched the makeshift resonance device tightly, his hands trembling despite himself. Mara walked beside him, her face set in grim determination. The rest of the rebels followed in silence, their weapons at the ready. The Hive seemed to close in around them, its fleshy walls narrowing and twisting as they delved deeper. It felt alive, like the Hive itself was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The first chamber they entered was a grotesque mockery of a cathedral. The ceiling arched high above, its surface studded with bioluminescent sacs that bathed the room in a sickly green light. At the center of the chamber was a mound of flesh, pulsating and heaving like a diseased heart. Nathan froze when he realized what it was. Bodies, hundreds of them, fused together into a single undulating mass. Arms, legs, and faces jutted out at impossible angles, their expressions locked in eternal agony. Some of the faces were fresh, their eyes still moving, their mouths silently screaming. Others had begun to decay, their flesh sloughing off to reveal the raw muscle beneath. Mara stopped beside him, her jaw tight. "This is what it does to them," she said quietly. "It doesn't just kill, it takes them, uses them." Nathan swallowed hard, forcing down the bile that rose in his throat. Why? Why leave them like this? "To send a message," Mara replied. Her voice was cold, but Nathan caught the flicker of pain in her eyes. "To remind us what happens when we resist." Derek moved ahead, gesturing for the others to follow. They skirted the edge of the chamber, their footsteps eerily muffled by the fleshy ground. Nathan couldn't tear his eyes away from the mound. One of the faces, a young woman's, turned toward him. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. He forced himself to look away. The deeper they went, the worse it became. The hive seemed to change as they moved through it, the walls shifting and narrowing until they were forced to crawl through a series of tunnels. The tunnels were slick with the same mucus-like substance they had seen outside, and the air grew hotter and more oppressive with each passing moment. Nathan's heart raced as he thought about the harvesters that patrolled these depths. He had seen what they could do. If they were caught here, there would be no escape. The group emerged into another chamber, this one smaller but no less horrifying. The walls were lined with pods, translucent sacs filled with a viscous fluid. Inside each pod was a human, their bodies twisted and distorted as alien tendrils burrowed into their flesh. Nathan approached one of the pods, his stomach twisting as he saw the person inside. A man, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth frozen mid-scream. The tendrils had burrowed into his chest, his arms, his legs, his face. His body convulsed weakly, as though he were still alive. "Don't touch it," Mara warned, pulling Nathan back. "You can't help them." Nathan turned to her, his voice trembling. "We can't just leave them like this." "We have no choice," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "If we stop now, we die here. Focus on the mission." Nathan nodded reluctantly, his chest tight with guilt. He couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took deeper into the hive was a step over the bodies of those they had failed to save. As they pressed on, the group's tension grew. The tunnels became narrower, the walls closing in until they were forced to walk single file. The thrum of the hive grew louder, more insistent, as if it could sense their presence. Nathan's hands were slick with sweat, his grip on the resonance device slipping. Derek muttered curses under his breath, his irritation bubbling over as the oppressive heat and stench began to take their toll. Finally, they reached the outer edge of the hive's core. The chamber before them was massive, its walls lined with writhing tendrils that radiated outward from a central structure. The core itself was a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and machinery, a pulsating mass of nerve-like fibers and glowing sacs. It was alive, and it was aware. Nathan felt a wave of nausea as he stepped into the chamber. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the thrum of the hive was so loud it made his teeth ache. He turned to Mara. "This is it. Once we plant the device, it's going to know we're here." Mara nodded. "Then we make it count." As Nathan set to work, the others formed a defensive perimeter around him. The resonance device was bulky and unwieldy, its exposed wires sparking as he connected them to the power source. He could feel the hive around him, its presence pressing against his mind like an unseen weight. It wasn't just alive, it was intelligent, and it was angry. The first wave came without warning. The walls split open, and harvesters poured into the chamber, their grotesque forms skittering toward the group with horrifying speed. The rebels fought fiercely, their makeshift weapons cutting through the creature's flesh, but the Hive's forces were relentless. Nathan worked as quickly as he could, his hands shaking as he adjusted the device's settings. Derek let out a triumphant shout as he drove his blade into a harvester's skull, but his victory was short-lived. A tendril lashed out from the wall, piercing his side and dragging him toward the Hive. Mara screamed his name, but there was nothing she could do. Derek was pulled into the mass, his cries silenced as the tendrils enveloped him. Nathan activated the device just as the Hive's core began to shift. The resonance wave pulsed outward, and the chamber shook violently. The harvesters faltered, their movements becoming erratic as the Hive's control over them wavered. Mara grabbed Nathan, pulling him toward the exit. "Move! We have to get out of here." As they fled, Nathan glanced back at the core. It writhed and screamed, its glowing sacs bursting one by one. But even as it collapsed, he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly killed it. The Hive wasn't just a thing, it was a presence, and it wasn't going to die easily. The air within the Hive's core was suffocating, thick with the smell of burning flesh and the sharp tang of exposed nerves. The resonance device had done its job, destabilizing the outer layers of Kerathi's grotesque neural network. Tendrils flailed wildly across the chamber, severing from the walls in convulsive jerks. The Hive screamed, an unholy sound that reverberated through the marrow of Nathan's bones, as though the planet itself were dying. But Karathis wasn't finished. As Nathan and Mara pushed deeper into the crumbling core, the walls around them shifted, sloughing off layers of decaying tissue to reveal something that made Nathan's stomach lurch. The brain of Karathis wasn't a single mass, as he had theorized, but a pulsating network of intertwined organs. It stretched up into the darkness like a living cathedral, its surface dotted with glowing, bloodshot eyes and mouths that moaned ceaselessly. Tendrils snaked out from the central structure, weaving through the Hive and connecting it to every part of the planet. Nathan clutched the resonance device tightly, his fingers slick with sweat and alien ichor. He knew what he had to do, but his body rebelled at the thought. The device needed to be planted at the very heart of the core, in the nexus where the tendrils were thickest. To get there, they'd have to traverse the most dangerous part of the Hive. "This is it," Mara said, her voice steady but hollow. She was covered in cuts and burns, her face streaked with ash and blood. One of her arms hung limp at her side, the hastily bandaged stump where Nathan had amputated her infected flesh still oozing through the fabric. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. "No going back." Nathan nodded, unable to speak. He looked at her, wanting to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. They stepped forward together. The Hive retaliated immediately. The walls convulsed and the ground beneath them split open, revealing pools of viscous fluid that bubbled and hissed. Shapes emerged from the walls and ceiling, grotesque amalgamations of flesh and bone that twisted into forms barely recognizable as creatures. Some had too many limbs, others none at all. Their bodies writhed with tendrils that snapped like whips, and their faces, if they could be called faces, were contorted into masks of rage and agony. "Keep moving," Mara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Nathan stumbled as a tendril lashed out, slicing across his thigh. Pain flared, but he forced himself to stay upright, limping toward the central structure. Mara moved ahead of him, cutting down one of the creatures with a savage swing of her weapon. The blade sank into its chest, releasing a spray of black ichor that sizzled as it hit the ground. The creatures were relentless. One lunged at Nathan, its misshapen limbs flailing wildly. He swung the resonance device like a club, smashing it into the creature's head. The impact sent him sprawling, but the creature collapsed in a heap, twitching spasmodically. Nathan scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. The Nexus loomed ahead, a tangled mass of nerves and tendrils that pulsed with a sickly yellow-green light. Nathan could feel the heat emanating from it, could hear the low, guttural hum that seemed to come from deep within its core. The resonance device in his hands vibrated faintly, as if it too could feel the Hive's raw power. They reached the base of the Nexus, but Karathis was waiting for them. The tendrils pulled back, coiling like serpents before striking. Mara moved faster than Nathan thought possible, throwing herself in front of him as a tendril lashed out. It pierced her side, driving through flesh and bone. She didn't scream. "Mara!" Nathan shouted, his voice breaking. He reached for her, but she pushed him away, her face pale but determined. "Finish it," she gasped, blood bubbling from her lips. "Don't stop. You can't stop." Nathan hesitated for a fraction of a second, a fraction too long. The Nexus reacted, its tendrils surging toward him in a frenzy. Mara, with the last of her strength, tore the tendril from her body and threw herself at the Nexus, using her own body to shield Nathan. "Go!" she screamed, her voice raw and feral. Nathan didn't look back. He forced himself forward, climbing the fleshy, quivering mass of the Nexus. The tendrils lashed at him, tearing his clothes, cutting into his skin, but he kept going. His hands found the center of the Nexus, a pulsating, translucent sac filled with glowing, writhing fluid. The device in his hands whined, its resonance building to a deafening pitch. Nathan placed it against the sack, his fingers slick with blood and ichor. He activated the final sequence, his vision blurring as the device began to vibrate violently. The Hive screamed. The sound was indescribable, a raw, primal agony that shook the walls and sent shockwaves through the air. The Nexus convulsed, its tendrils writhing and snapping as the resonance wave tore through it. Nathan felt the ground beneath him collapse, and for a moment he was weightless, falling into darkness. When he hit the ground, the impact drove the air from his lungs. He gasped, rolling onto his back. The Nexus was collapsing, its tendrils curling inward as the resonance device overloaded. The light from the sack grew brighter and brighter until it was blinding, forcing Nathan to shield his eyes, and then silence. When Nathan opened his eyes, the Hive was gone. The walls were still, the tendrils limp and lifeless. The pulsating thrum that had haunted him since his arrival had finally ceased. But Mara was gone too. Nathan crawled to the spot where she had fallen. Her body was still, her eyes closed, her face peaceful for the first time since he had met her. He reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it on her shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Above him, the sky began to change. The crimson clouds parted, revealing a sliver of pale light. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Terra Umbra, for the first time in centuries, was free. Nathan stood, his body battered and broken but alive. He looked toward the horizon, where the ruins of the Hive smoldered in the distance. He didn't know what came next, whether he would ever find a way back to his own universe, or if he was destined to remain here. But as he turned away from the ruins, the faintest hint of a smile crossed his lips. Mara's sacrifice had not been in vain. Far beneath the rubble, deep in the remnants of the Hive, a faint, pulsing glow flickered once, then again. A single tendril twitched, its tip curling toward the light. Karathis wasn't gone, not entirely, and it was patient.